Here are 5 things to know about JavaScript callbacks. Firstly, callbacks rely on higher order functions. They rely on a function that's going to accept it as an argument. These higher order functions will receive that function and not really know what it does or what logic it contains. It doesn't actually care. All it does is accept it, execute it at some point, and maybe pass specific arguments to it when it gets executed. So for example, in this function over here, we have a numbers array, a function called square, which is going to receive a number and return the squared result. And we're going to pass that square function to the array.map method. It's going to receive it as an argument and it's going to execute it on each item of the array. So .map is the higher order function that is expecting to receive another function as an argument, and it's going to execute it for us, in this case, on each item of the array. Number 2, reference values make callbacks possible. I have a whole separate mini course on this specific concept. Without pointers and reference values, we wouldn't be able to pass functions, arrays, and objects around. Callbacks need to be passed to another function as an argument, and that means we need the pointer to it. We need a little island with a telescope pointing up at that function ship. Then we have the coordinates for that value, and we can pass it wherever we want to. For example, here we have a function to uppercase, and then we have another function map strings, which is expecting 2 types of references: a reference to an array and a reference to a callback. It doesn't know what's in the array, it doesn't know what's in the callback. What it does do is iterate through that array and execute the callback on each item of that array, just like the .map function we just looked at. In our mental model, we need to be clear that we're not passing the entire function or the entire array into another function. We're just passing the pointer so that we can locate it. Number 3, generally you don't have control over the parameters of that callback function or the arguments that get passed to it. That is up to the higher order function. And this is actually something that confuses a lot of people. You might think because you're defining the callback function, like in this example where we are creating a click handler is going to be the callback function we pass to add event listener. And because we're defining click handler, we might think that we can add in whatever parameters we want here. We can create a whole bunch of parameters for whatever arguments we want to receive. But the reality is we don't have control over what gets passed to that function when it gets executed. That's up to add event listener. Add event listener is going to decide what gets passed to that function. And in this case, it's just an event object, a specific type of object that we can expect to receive, which is why we can create our callbacks knowing what data we will be able to work with when that function is executed. Number 4, callbacks are not always to do with asynchronous operations. We tend to just think of callbacks as things related to click events or maybe a set timeout. So over here, this arrow function is going to get executed when the timer finishes, but callbacks don't have to be related to something asynchronous. For example, function greeting, which is a simple string concatenation, it performs that logic, and we can imagine a real-life example where there is quite complex synchronous operations, calculations going on. And at the end of that calculation, we just are executing that callback that we receive. And then when we're using that function, the greeting function, we can pass whatever callback we want in there, knowing that that function is going to get executed once everything has finished. Finally, callbacks are not old school. Just because the new async await syntax is starting to replace the .then callback pattern doesn't mean that callbacks are an old way of doing things. Yes, you do want to avoid something called callback hell when you have multiple callbacks running one after another, and it can be very difficult to read and maintain that code. But the pattern of using a function that gets passed to another function that is in charge of executing it at a specific time, like at the end of an operation, remains an important part of how many libraries, frameworks, and browser APIs work. And it is worth understanding when and how to use these callbacks. Hope you enjoyed that. Make sure to check out my free course on thegreatsync.com that introduces reference values, pointers, and callbacks using a visual, memorable way of explaining fundamental concepts.